For 60 years, this photograph convinced the world a monster lived in Loch Ness. It was fake. But the man behind it wasn't trying to make anyone believe in a monster. He was settling a score with a newspaper. And his plan worked for 6 decades without them ever knowing it was him. April 1934. A London gynecologist's photograph runs in the Daily Mail. A long neck, a small head, rising out of dark water in Scotland's Loch Ness. Within days, it's everywhere. Newspapers around the world reprint it. It becomes the single image people picture when they hear the words Loch Ness Monster. But the monster wasn't new. The modern legend had started less than a year earlier, in May 1933, when the Inverness Courier ran a small story under the headline, "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness." A couple driving the newly built lakeside road claimed they'd watched something enormous roll and plunge in the water. A local water bailiff named Alex Campbell would go on to claim 18 sightings of his own, some at close range, and became the story's most quoted witness. That single local story didn't stay local for long. National papers picked it up within months. By October, the Scotsman had sent its own journalist up from Edinburgh to investigate. A circus put up a reward of £20,000 for the animal's capture. Tourists began driving up just to sit in boats and deck chairs along the shore, waiting. The Daily Mail wanted in on the story properly, not just reporting sightings but finding proof. In December 1933, they commissioned a man to go get it, Marmaduke Wetherell, a big game hunter with a flair for showmanship, hired specifically to track down the creature. What happened next would make Wetherell a laughingstock, and set in motion the real story behind the photograph that made the monster immortal. Wetherell moved fast. Within days of arriving at the loch, he announced he'd found footprints along the shore, big ones, from what he described as a powerful, soft-footed animal, roughly 20 feet long. He cast them, sent the cast to the Natural History Museum, and the Daily Mail ran the story before the results came back, under the headline, "Monster of Loch Ness is not legend but fact." The results, when they came, hippopotamus. Specifically, a mounted hippo-foot umbrella stand, the kind found in Victorian sitting rooms. Case closed, and not in Wetherell's favour. He was mocked in print, publicly, in the pages of his own employer's newspaper. The Daily Mail let the humiliation stand. Weeks later, a new photo lands on their desk. This time, credited to someone else entirely, a respected London physician, Robert Kenneth Wilson, a gynecologist by trade, though the world would come to know him simply as the surgeon, the label that stuck to the photograph itself. He claimed he simply happened to be looking at the loch through a camera when the creature surfaced. Look closely, and none of it adds up. No sense of scale in the frame, no shoreline for reference, ripples that behave more like the wake of something small close to the camera than something large far away. For decades, most people only ever saw the photo cropped tight around the monster. When researchers eventually tracked down the original uncropped negative, the creature filled only a tiny portion of the frame, and the full image, background and all, gave away just how little it actually showed. The photo was authentic, in the sense that it was a real, unaltered photograph of something floating in the water. It just wasn't a monster. The confession took 60 years to surface, and it didn't come easily. In the early 1990s, researcher David Martin was going through old newspaper archives and came across a 1975 article, long forgotten, in which one of Wetherell's own relatives had hinted the photo was faked. That thread led Martin and his colleague, Alistair Boyd, to a name they hadn't been looking for, Maurice Chambers, a mutual acquaintance who'd apparently connected Wetherell to Wilson in the first place. Following that thread further, Boyd and Martin tracked down Christian Sperling, Marmaduke Wetherell's stepson, in his 90s by then, living quietly in the south of England. In 1993, weeks before his death, Sperling confessed. He said Wetherell had approached him after the hippo foot humiliation with a plan. Build a small model, mount it on a toy submarine hull, photograph it on the loch, and let the press do the rest. Sperling built it. Wetherall's son Ian took the photographs, and the physician, Wilson, was recruited, through Chambers, as the front man, the name that would go to the press, lending the whole thing the credibility of a respected professional with nothing to gain, rather than a disgraced hunter with everything to prove. Sperling died before the story broke publicly, but his account didn't stand alone for long. Months later, while sorting through unrelated archive material, Boyd and Martin turned up old letters that confirmed something nobody had found before. Wilson's own private admission of the hoax, in his own words, sitting untouched in someone else's papers for decades. Two separate trails, a confession and a paper record, had landed on the same answer, without either man having planned it. The motive was revenge, pure and simple. Wetherall had been humiliated in print by the Daily Mail over the Hippo hoax, and rather than walk away, he handed them the exact story they wanted, knowing they'd never look hard enough at a win to question it. For 60 years, that calculation held. The paper that mocked him ran his hoax on its front page and never knew. None of it stopped the legend, even after the truth came out. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, university teams and independent researchers ran sonar sweeps across the loch, again and again, each expedition coming back with strange, unexplained readings, but never a body and never proof. When the 1994 revelation finally broke, confirming the most famous photo of all was a toy on a string, it barely slowed any of it down. The tourists kept coming. The loch kept its name. On a personal note, the most fascinating aspect of this story for me is that the 1934 hoax photo has ever been taken seriously in the first place and became one of the most well-known fake photographs. It basically shows nothing, but it's a good story, and that's what many people prefer to believe over reason. The Loch Ness Monster didn't need to exist for this story to work. It just needed a newspaper hungry enough for a headline, and one embarrassed man patient enough to give them exactly what they were asking for. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in a few weeks' time. Have a nice summer.